Welcome to the IVF Abroad podcast for people who are struggling with infertility and trying to conceive, and who are facing more obstacles than options when it comes to having fertility testing or treatment in their home countries. Alongside other experts, I will share, educate and empower you on your journey and help you to learn more about going abroad for advanced fertility testing and treatments like IVF and egg donation. I'm Emma Haslam, your host, now mum of one, and the go-to expert in fertility treatment abroad. Since the birth of our son in 2018, I have made it my mission to make fertility treatment more informed, transparent, accessible, supported and affordable for more people. And I help people just like you to become unstuck, to find a best fit clinic that truly meets their needs, and to have fertility treatment on their terms and timescales so they can achieve their dreams of growing their families. And I'm here now to help you too. Be sure to check out the free resources in the show notes for more help after listening to today's episode. Hello and welcome back to the IVF Abroad podcast with me, Emma Haslam, your host and infertile now mum of one. And I'm really excited because I have a guest with me today. And we're going to be discussing a topic that I think is super important. And that is whether high BMI pregnancies automatically mean high risk, as we are often led to believe. And understanding a bit more about what the data says and what is actually, in fact, more fear-mongering perhaps in medical settings. And I wanted to bring this topic to the table because I support a lot of people with higher BMIs. And I have a lot of people who follow me on Instagram and in my email community with higher BMIs as well. And they know that I can help them to access inclusive fertility treatment. But some of those people are worried about the point past that they become pregnant and worrying about what their experiences might then be in healthcare settings, generally based on negative experiences that they've had based around weight in the past. So I asked Dr. Alice Keely, who is the Heavyweight Midwife, to come and join me to chat through this topic. Dr. Alice Keely helps plus-size women have a happier and more empowered journey to parenthood. And she's been a plus-size specialist midwife since 2007, completing her PhD in women's experiences of stigma in plus-size pregnancy care. Through her research, her advocacy, and her online courses and coaching, Alice now works to get the reassurance out there that having a plus-size pregnancy does not have to mean you're going to have a high-risk pregnancy. So super important work. Welcome, Alice.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for that introduction. And we've answered the first question there, haven't we? That no, it's not a high-risk pregnancy if you're plus size. So I'm looking forward to chatting through the nitty-gritty of all of that. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. So obviously I have introduced you slightly, but I'd love you to introduce yourself, and I'd love you to tell people, because you just told me before we press record, how you kind of went from training as a midwife through to the work that you're now doing. So can I hand over to you?
Yeah, well, I was saying that I waffle a bit, but I'll try and do this in a succinct way. So I qualified as a midwife in 2001, and I've trained in London. And when I was fairly newly qualified, I worked in a team that looked after women who mostly had pre-existing health conditions. So they had complex pregnancies, but the team was so brilliant in terms of the way that all the doctors, midwives, and everybody else worked together, that that sort of person-centeredness and that kind of not necessarily thinking this is high risk, this is low risk, that was kind of really instilled into me quite early on. So I was always really grateful for that. And when I then moved to Scotland, I got a job as a specialist midwife, setting up this plus-size pregnancy clinic. And although that was really fascinating to me, and I enjoyed looking after all the women, after a while I started to question whether it was the best way to care for women was to have a sort of a label. It was called a metabolic clinic. It was like a clinic where women were invited to if their BMI was measured at 40 or more. And I just started to wonder about their experiences of that care. And I cutting that part of the story short, I got funding eventually to do my PhD in experiences, which turned out to be around sort of stigma in healthcare, where I spoke to women, a lot of women and their partners and birth partners. So then, because I had a PhD, I was able to get a job as a researcher and a lecturer. So I've been working in universities and not working in direct clinical care for the last few years. And I just really missed it. And I really, really missed kind of applying all this knowledge and this passion that I had for plus size advocacy, really. So this light bulb came on in 2022 when I dreamt up the Heavyweight Midwife. That's where that came from. And I was saying to you, wasn't it, that I was on holiday actually, and I think that sometimes happens when you let your brain have a rest. You have a good idea when you rested, and I just had the idea for it. And at the time, me and my daughter had an Instagram account for the dog. It was like a golden retriever account. I had about 8 followers. So that's been all the plus size pregnancies knowledge was there, but the social media and the kind of work, stepping outside of the public sector work, that's been quite a learning curve. But yeah, so it's nearly 3 years that the Heavyweight Midwife's been since she was born. So that's how that came about. And there's the satisfaction in just helping so many thousands of women. It is thousands now, because I have a community where people have access to me and access to each other, and forming these relationships. It's just incredibly rewarding. So yeah, I love it.
Oh, thank you for setting that up. But my first question, which I feel is super important, are you still running the Golden Retriever Instagram account?
I mean, it's active. I don't. I'm very busy these days. I'm a lecturer and I'm the Heavyweight Midwife. So yeah, I don't think I do. And my daughter might have moved on as well from, she was 11 then, and she's 15 now. So that's she's got other interests, shall we say? Yeah.
That ship has sailed. Love that. I love that. Can you explain to me, Alice, what high risk pregnancy is supposed to mean in medical terms? Because we hear this a lot, don't we? But what does that actually mean?
Well, yeah, it's I guess the problem is that it means nothing really at all, and it also is incredibly meaningful in terms of how you feel about your pregnancy when it's labelled as high risk. But specifically, it means nothing, and it's also misleading because it's to me, high risk is so problematic because, and I may be different to other people, but I think when someone says this is a high risk activity, this is a high risk pregnancy, it sounds like complications are likely. That's what that sounds like to me.
Me too.
And that is just absolutely not. I mean, the number of women whose pregnancies would be likely to have complications is tiny, and those women are women who have, unfortunately, have specific medical, often cardiac conditions. So they have actual medical problems. And as I said to you earlier in my career, I was very used to looking after women who had physical, medical challenges or complications of pregnancy, which, such as preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, things that arise due to pregnancy, or medical problems that exist prior to pregnancy that make that a complex circumstances. Things like raised BMI and being older, in fact, they're things that we don't really know much about, actually. So scientists and doctors don't know much about, why it might be that complications are a bit more likely. And the reason why they're a bit more likely are complicated and not all related to the physical sort of circumstances of just being overweight or being older, for example. So because you have doctors, scientists, and you have policymakers who are making big financial decisions, what you get is just generalizations about groups of women. So if you look at a group of women, let's say, and you talk about pregnancy care, if women with a raised BMI, we know they're more likely to have emergency cesarean sections, right? And the reason for that are very complicated and definitely include the way that they get cared for. So there's definitely sort of it's not just about their physical weight. It's about all the complexities, including stigma. It's a really complex picture. But what that gets distilled into is that women with a high BMI are more likely to have cesarean, so it's higher risk for them. That's a higher risk for them. And that's really problematic for an individual person because it doesn't tell you anything about an individual person. An individual person who's sitting in a bigger body next to a very, very slim person in a waiting room, nobody can say to them that they are more likely to have complications, that they're higher risk, because nobody knows. And in fact, if you do go back to the stats and look across a whole population, even when you look at those statistics and the chances, the averages, your risk, if you want to call it that, of experiencing gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, having a big baby, all of these things that there's a lot of scaremongering about. Although across the population the risk is higher, it's very small. It's very low. So it's such a problematic term because it doesn't specifically tell you anything. It's really frightening, and you're not likely to have complications. And actually, in complicated ways, health professionals make it more likely that you will have complications by telling you that you're high risk. So, yeah, I despise it. I hate it. I really do.
So do I. So why do you think then that it is used so much around BMI when it comes to healthcare settings?
Well, I mean, we practice within a sort of we've got a risk-focused medical culture.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody gets talked to about risk. And what we are doing, so as midwives, what we're doing is we're looking after women that are deemed to be low risk. And we're also involved in the care of women that are deemed to be high risk, but we are trained to identify deviations from anything that's normal within pregnancy development, and involve doctors and other specialists if we needed to. So everything that we're doing is focusing on the risk, on identifying, mitigating risk, and so everybody, there's a lot of problems that plus size women come up against, that everybody comes up against. It's just that the focus is on weight, if that's one of your kind of factors that's going to be identified. So there's that sort of there's that overall kind of context to it that it's for pregnancy care is increasing sort of medicalized and risk focused. And then it is to do with there's weight stigma. There's just fat phobia. There's weight stigma that individuals can hold, and that can be really complicated between different professionals. So there's the luck of the draw in terms of who you come up against when you come up against or who you meet to give you your care. That can be kind of better or so much worse in terms of who you meet. But within the system, within the guidelines, even if you are working with an incredibly compassionate, dedicated midwife who wants to provide that personalized care to you, there are guidelines that are written with a very sort of broad brush. They're very blunt. So we use BMI as a measurement. It's obvious that BMI has got lots of problems to it because it's just you definitely can't make all the assumptions about someone's weight and health that are made, based on a number.
Yeah.
There's so much we don't understand about health. But I mean, most women give birth in a hospital that helps thousands and thousands of women every year to have babies. Ever since I've been a midwife, which is 25 years, we talk about continuity of care, we talk about person-centered care, we talk about choice and control, but the system is not set up to give that at all. And it increasingly also has funding and staffing issues within it. So what I mean, I'm ranging around a little bit here, but I'll also mention at this point is that what I'd like to do and what I struggle with a lot on social media is kind of NHS bashing. So what I know from all my years in the NHS, and I trained student midwives, I work with midwives closely now, is just overwhelmingly dedicated people that are working in incredibly difficult circumstances. And possibly when we're talking about BMI and plus size, there's a great proportion who I have to work harder to get them to understand that, this sort of nuance around this is, you can't just tell somebody that they're high risk because their BMI is above 30. That's not the way that it works. So that but mostly people just do want to. I don't want you to kind of expect that things will be difficult and that people will be unkind or disrespectful to you. But I think that is there can be a lack of understanding that there are guidelines. There are guidelines that might say, for example, something I spend a lot of time talking to people about is wanting to have access to midwife-led care, so midwife-led units, water birth, those sorts of things, and there being guidelines around restrictions or access to those things that people really, really want, and which actually, if they want them, are really, will be really good for them. So it doesn't make sense to restrict it. But I spend a lot of people kind of time helping people to advocate for those sorts of things. But it's basically because the short answer is because the system is not set up to provide personalised care for pregnancy, that we want and we deserve, and also that some practitioners prefer to kind of work within the safety of guidelines and think of them as rules rather than guidelines, which are actually, those are very different things. So a lot of what I do is helping people to navigate, much as what you do actually, but to navigate a little bit further down the line once they are pregnant and they're wanting to get the care that they need there.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I mean, I too love the NHS, and I agree that it's a system that is massively underfunded, overburdened, and a lot of people who work in the NHS are fantastic, and they can often only operate within the guidelines that they've been given, and some of people, like you quite rightly said, feel that they are the rules that they need to live by and that they carry the risk of that if they don't, and the repercussions of that if something were to happen, if they don't follow it. And this also happens in private care as well, not just in the NHS. I think, the NHS perhaps more so because of the systemic problems and the pressure that it's under, rather than it coming down necessarily to individuals in the NHS. I think, there are individuals privately and in the NHS where there is absolute inherent fat phobia. And people,
yeah.
as you say, not using the information as rules rather than guidelines, and people under pressure, people very busy, and then people not having the experience that they should be having. What does the research actually say about plus size pregnancies and risk? Like, is there any? Because I had Nicola Salmon on the podcast a few weeks ago, and she was saying that some of the problems with some of the research is that there's fat phobia within the research. But actually, from a medical point of view, would you say that, like, what does the research actually say about plus size pregnancies and risk?
Nicola's right, and actually, I didn't realise until I was on Nicola's podcast recently is that Nicola and I both have a background in research, so we've both done postgraduate research, and so and it's like anything where you get into the kind of when you get into the detail of something, and that's another thing with social media is that when you get into the dense detail of reading research papers, that things are just really, really complicated, and you don't and because researchers in universities, they want a soundbite, they want to get into the press. Their press office will release something that's going to be headline grabbing, and of course, media and social media, they want attention. Then messages get distilled into into a soundbite, into a message that's usually it usually reflects something close to what the findings actually were. But it's an incredibly it's an incredibly complex thing. One thing I just want to jump back to actually, from just before we move away from that topic, what you said about NHS staff and using thinking of guidelines as rules and worrying about repercussions. And I think that's it's an incredibly important point, because that is a misunderstanding that lots of healthcare professionals hold. And I think that when health professionals sort of take the time to what underpins the guidelines that they will be referring to. So they'll be referring to national guidelines, and they will also have their own trust guide. If they work in an NHS hospital, they'll have their own trust guidelines, which will look similar to national guidelines, but sometimes there are differences. So bear with me, I'm making a really important point here. So for example, national guidelines don't say anything about plus size women having water births. They just sort of talk about fetal monitoring, and they talk about blood loss, and they talk about being in a midwife-led unit, but nothing specifically about water births. So hospitals themselves will have to write their own guide. If they've got pools, they'll have to have guidelines about the use of those pools. So they'll write those, and that's why they will vary. So that's why when you go to one hospital, they might say the guidelines say that we don't recommend you to use water or come to the midwife-led unit if your BMI is above 35. But another hospital, that might be 30. Another hospital, that might be 40. Hospitals have different cultures. They have different cultures that are often led by how about the consultants. So they have a lot of power clinically, and how sort of well respected midwives are. There can be very different cultures, and finding out about your local hospitals, facilities, and culture, it can be a really important thing to do. But what individual midwives and doctors as well would tend to do is, you're right, think, well, I'm not going to say to somebody that they should just like go against the guidelines and advocate for a water birth when their BMI is 45, because that could come back on me. If I look after this woman, something goes wrong. And that's that's absolutely a fundamental misunderstanding of what we do as healthcare professionals. Is we are evidence-based practitioners. We tell people what the evidence says about their wanting to have a water birth. What does the evidence tell us? And then we let them make a decision about what they want to do, and we provide care for them. And so what we need to do is ensure that the information we're giving them is correct, and if you've done that, then there never can be any repercussions on, because it's their decision, and it's absolutely not serving people to just say, oh no, you won't be able to have a water birth if your BMI is 35, because we don't. It's not safe. Yeah. We don't let you do that.
And that, I think, unfortunately for lots of people, it won't be for everybody, is what happens. It's what happened to me.
Absolutely.
And I was told, you will be consultant led because you have a higher BMI and you had IVF. You are like gestational diabetes. If you'd informed,
you would have said, oh, why would I be consultant led, and how will that benefit me? And then when they explain that to you, I think you'll say yes. Okay, I'll have that.
People don't feel confident enough to do that, because they're sort of told, like I was told, you are likely to get gestational diabetes. So like, okay,
exactly. I actually had my mission. That is my mission, that women know. They get to know. So when they have the conversation,
then make your own decision. It never felt like I had decisions to make. I was also told, I had a very healthy pregnancy, by the way. I was also told that I would not be allowed a water birth. I did actually by that point advocate for myself, and I was able to use the pool.
Lovely.
I didn't end up giving birth in the water, but I did get to use the pool.
Well, lots of women don't, but they, and also just knowing that you have, in the run up to having your baby, knowing that you have that option. Maybe you don't even want to do it on the day, but if you've got that agreement in place that that's what you're going to do, if everything is straightforward, that's you've had that agreement, and no one said to you, oh no, you're not allowed, because we don't do that if your BMI is over 35.
And then the other thing I was told, and I'm not alone in this, was we won't allow you to go over. They were the words of you. We will not allow you to go over because you're a higher risk pregnancy because of your BMI, because you're IVF. So we will induce you.
Yeah.
Now, actually, I really wish that I hadn't let them induce me and we would have waited. um, but it's the language, because I think, you've highlighted a point there. I didn't know that actually, as long as a healthcare professional, you are giving people the evidence that they can make informed decisions, which is how
Yeah.
it should be, of course, and how obviously some people will do it, then of course that makes complete sense, that then mitigates the responsibility and ownership from the
Mhm.
healthcare professional. But just shutting people down and saying, you can't or you will. I didn't get gestational diabetes. They frightened me to death, and I was absolutely fine. Absolutely fine.
Well, and actually, you were always very likely to be fine. I do a little quiz with my second year students because they've been in clinical practice for a while, so they get teaching from us, and then they go into the
Yeah.
clinical placement. So they spend half the year, spend half their first year in clinical practice. So I do a little quiz. It's a multiple choice. I shouldn't be unfair to them. But it is a multiple choice answer as well. It's quite an easy one for them to answer. What proportion of plus size women, whatever their weight, and we say we're called plus size. We call plus size. I mean, when people ask me, I say, well, I will say it's with a BMI of 30 or more, but only because that's when people start to get things recommended to them. But that's when it sort of
Yes.
impacts upon your health. It's really just if you identify yourself as plus size, or it's anything. It's anything. But I would say what, because that's who gets the fear of God put into them. What proportion of plus size women, what percentage will develop gestational diabetes? And I do a little. Most usually they guess. I think there's 40 to 50% is one of the options, and that's one. That's what they go for. It's somewhere around 40%. Um, and it's in reality, it depends on where you look for your evidence, but somewhere between 10 to 20% of plus size women, whatever they weigh, so we're going up to the very highest BMI,
Mm-hmm.
will develop gestational diabetes. So that's 80 to 90% of plus size women don't get it.
And how does that compare to people with a BMI of under 30?
So again, depending on where you look at your information,
Yeah.
somewhere between sort of somewhere between sort of 5 to 8%. So it does. So it's as a pregnancy, as a complication of pregnancy, it's relatively common. It's much more common than we want it to be, but it's certainly it and it's the one of the complications of pregnancy that it's absolutely established that you are more likely to develop it if you are plus size. It's caused by your placenta. It's caused by pregnancy, but for lots of different reasons that we don't understand well. And this is why I get a bit cross when doctors kind of present things in a confident way as if they're sure about stuff, because they're generally just not sure about stuff. But they like to, I mean, I think they try to make people feel better sometimes with their confident manner. But if they're presenting restrictions around or
Mm.
recommendations for interventions like induction around things like plus size pregnancy, I don't like it. But yeah, it's still it's still a relatively you're much more likely to not get gestational diabetes than to get
Yeah, then you are.
diabetes, no matter what you weigh, and everybody can get it. But I think people so I had a little bit of I'm on TikTok, and I had a little bit of pushback on TikTok yesterday. Sometimes happens because I think sometimes people just misunderstand what the message that I'm giving. So I think it's a really good idea to get tested for gestational diabetes. If it's recommended to you for a reason.
Yeah,
I,
I
I
do.
think if you've got gestational diabetes, it's really good. It's a really good idea to identify that. Yeah,
Yes.
and if needs to be to treat it. And actually, the research shows us that there's a sort of group of women around sort of just under the threshold of 30 where they want to test for BMI sort of 27, 28, 29 who get missed because they don't get tested. And there have been, sometimes babies grow big or it's not identified. It's a really good idea to get identified. So I wouldn't, I'm never saying to people, your pregnancy is not high risk, so don't worry about anything. I think that everyone ought to have individualized, very good care that reassures everyone that all is well and identifies when all is not well. But that's a different
Yeah.
thing to a sort of risk factor that
Yeah.
actually there's nothing inherent about being plus size that means
Yeah.
your pregnancy is high risk or complicated, until it becomes so, if it does. which you probably won't.
Exactly. And how do you think, like, in your experience, how does bias against larger bodies, do you think, show up in maternity care?
Um, so I think I, so for me, I think, I mean, I read quite a lot because I have quite a lot of community members from America, and I think in America it's a different situation, and there can be some very harsh, horrible, disrespectful, overtly stigmatizing
Mm.
care, and interactions, which is horrible. And I think that happens. I think it's a bit more. It's just a bit more kind of nuanced and um. Oh, what's the word? Sort of creeping. It's sort of in the. It's multi-layered, so it's in the system. Like as I said, it's sort of
Yeah.
personalized because of the nature of the way that we provide care.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that one massive mistake that, and I get asked this quite a lot. Um, I work with kind of local partners and providers within NHS trusts around. I have a lot of difficulties with approaches to like health promotion and healthy lifestyle and all of these kinds of phrases that I hate actually. So I've done I've got a public health masters, but that I think there are a lot of midwives think that if we promote health, if only we were to persuade people that them being overweight is bad for them, they would kind of they could be helped to sort things out. And I absolutely just don't see that as my role at all. I just don't. I mean, I wouldn't, even if somebody wanted my help, I wouldn't even help. I wouldn't even see myself as qualified. I'm a midwife. I'm not qualified to help people in that, and I'm not qualified to sort of judge what is best for them. And I absolutely am not going to assume that the reason that they have a high BMI or a plus size is that because they don't think it's a bad thing, or they're not aware of healthy living, or they don't know how to eat properly. So I think I think there's stigma in the assumptions that are made about people. Absolutely. That there are assumptions that people um, don't care about their health, that they don't know how to eat well, and I think there's a kind of an assumption that that complications will arise. So when I'm saying that, I said then sort of quite flippantly about my students, they're getting that message from working with health professionals, and health professionals learn from each other. So my students will be hearing there's all the things you described about your pregnancy care and
Mm-hmm.
when you had your baby are absolutely, you just could have got it from the script. That is what happens to so many, the majority of women. So we won't be letting you go beyond blah number of weeks because you're high risk for this. So you'll need to have an induction because there are greater risks of this, and this. And that's what students hear. And so unless they're really kind of clued in and they think independently and listen to me and read lots of the evidence, all the complicated stuff, rather than just reading the guidelines, they look at the evidence, that the research papers that are at the end of the guidelines in the reference list, and they actually look at what does this evidence really say. Then they will just carry on. They will just carry on saying those same things that they're trained to say. So some 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 people make judgments about plus size people, but
Oh, yeah.
even those ones that don't, they still perpetuate the stigma in the system. It's really multi-layered, and it's really complicated.
Yeah,
And there's
absolutely.
a lot to push back against.
And I think, from my experience of that, I mean, I have to say though, that was mainly from the consultant that I had. The midwife
Mm,
I had um, was different to that and
yeah,
did encourage me to advocate for myself, which was very, very helpful. Although I also found that quite tricky in that I've got one medical professional saying one
yeah,
thing and a consultant who is I suppose, more qualified, or that's what I thought, wrongly or rightly, saying another thing. Who do I
Yeah.
listen to? And that created conflict in my mind as well. And it definitely impacted my experience and added to my anxiety. I was already delighted about being pregnant, very anxious. Was I going to get to a live birth? And then I'd already felt like shit at, many points on my journey and blamed myself that the reason why we'd not conceived was down to weight. It wasn't anything to do with my weight. And really interestingly, every single client that I've helped with a higher BMI, it has not been to do with their weight either. But
Mhm.
this is the way that you are made to feel by lots of
Yeah.
people, by the system. And so, I felt if a consultant said something, I was like, oh, well, that's obviously the right thing, but
Yeah.
then cause a bit of conflict. And you've got this lovely midwife helping me and encouraging me to advocate for myself and, who wasn't fat phobic. But while that was helpful, I think the fact they weren't aligned wasn't helpful. And that made
Yeah.
me question, who should I be listening to? So, like, how do you see it impacting patient experience? That was my experience, but how do you see it impacting others when there's fat bias in maternity
Well,
care?
well, again, your experience is really quite common. It's not universal. So what I will have clients and community members who are having their first baby, um, and that there's often a stark difference between their needs and their um approach between them and someone that's having a second or subsequent baby, because they will have had an experience something along the lines of that. So lots of women second time around, because they um either have found that they had a straightforward pregnancy and birth, and they thought, "Oh, I'm not sure what I saw that consultant for," and they just talked a lot about risk, and that kind of worried
Yeah.
me. And then everything was fine. So they're not like, "Well, what was the point of that?" But they're like, "Well, so," and also what gets really neglected is the reassurance that when somebody has had a straightforward pregnancy and birth before, that anybody who's had a pregnancy before that's been straightforward, that walks in to see a consultant for an appointment, that consultant is thinking to themselves, "That's really reassuring. They've had a vaginal birth." So even if it's a forceps or a von two, so they had a vaginal birth, they didn't have any complications like preeclampsia or other things that may tend to reoccur. That's really reassuring. They often won't actually say that to that person in they're thinking it, but often when I tell people, it is really reassuring that it's hugely reassuring, because somebody who's not plus size, who's having their first baby, they kind of, to an obstetrician consultant, they're just an unknown quantity. So, but
Mm.
once they've had one pregnancy and it's gone well, it's gone okay, then that's really really reassuring. So women who've had that experience before that work with me, they just want to have a totally different pregnancy and birth experience, because they went along with the things they were advised to do. Because of course you do, you just want to do the best for you and your baby, and they're the experts and they're keeping you safe, and they're advising you to have an induction, and they're telling you that you're consultant led and all those things. So they're thinking, well, okay, so am I going to be consultant led this time? What's that for?
Yeah.
And they start to ask questions, because it's optional. I've got a really brilliant obstetrician coming on my podcast. I recorded with her a few weeks ago, and I'm going to release it soon. And she just says, my midwives that work, alongside me, when they have women in the clinics, they're just really sensible, and they give me a ring and say, do you need to see this woman, Florence, because this isn't this, and she's got a higher BMI, and then she's like, so I'll be like, well, no, not if she doesn't want to, because but no, there's nothing for her to do. Um, it's just a kind of it's in the guidelines to kind of have a conversation about risk. That's what the guidelines say. So
Yeah.
there are those women. Then there are women that had bad experiences, had failed inductions, as they call them, so kindly, and then had a cesarean section, who don't want to do that. They want to maybe have an elective, calmer cesarean section, or they want to have a vaginal birth after cesarean section. Or there are women that have had um, such as women that'll be listening to your podcast, that will have had a longer journey, a fertility journey, and then a pregnancy. So you're coming in with additional anxiety that gets transferred from the "will I get pregnant" into like, "will everything be okay now?" The elation of a positive pregnancy test lasts for about 10 minutes, and then the worry is
Yeah.
boom, the worry is somewhere else now. So I
Yeah.
have so yeah, just what they all have in common is, I would say, the way that stigma and fat phobia affects them is that they all worry about their health, and they worry about being the healthiest that they can be, and what that is and what that means in pregnancy, and what the risks might be that they've heard about of being plus size. But they also all worry about how they'll be treated, and that's in itself is bad for you to be worrying about, and even all the things that are reassuring. So if you get additional scans and people like that, and find that reassuring, and I never say to people like you should have additional scans, but I think you feel happy and relieved afterwards because you were worried beforehand, so it's just that sort of there's just so much worry through it, a lot of which is brought by that stigma and that kind of that sense that you're being judged and that your body is somehow imposing this risk.
That you are somehow at fault.
And also people have invariably all had at least one kind of incredibly negative interaction with healthcare in their past. That they you don't, even if you have 50 positive interactions, you're never going to get over that one, are you? Because they're just really damaging.
That's true. And I think there's a lot of self-blame for people going through this, particularly those on a fertility journey struggling to conceive.
Yeah.
You convince yourself this is somehow your fault anyway, so it just compounds the things that you already perhaps think about yourself. So other than sort of gestational diabetes risk, and like you are going to get gestational diabetes, Emma, I didn't. And you can't have a water birth. Are there any other common myths or misconceptions that you hear being said to people?
Yeah, so I think really it kind of goes along with the gestational diabetes one, but it gets kind of the waters get muddied. So growing a big baby, that's one that's because if you have gestational diabetes in itself is not the issue. The issue is uncontrolled gestational diabetes. So if you have uncontrolled gestational diabetes, that is when you can grow a baby that's bigger, in that associated with the diabetes, which can be a problem. But actually, women that are plus size just tend to get this sort of assumption made about that they probably will grow a bigger baby, whether or not they've even got diabetes, or let alone if it's controlled or not. So when you were talking there about the induction recommendation, that's a very typical picture, is that women have additional scans. They might have growth scans if they're plus size. And that's partly, so in the guidelines, that's because it's thought that measuring the growth of a baby and reassuring ourselves that a baby's growing well is more difficult. If you have a bigger tummy, it's difficult to measure with the highly technical paper tape measure that we use in clinics, which is sort of notoriously inaccurate as well, but that is what we use. So invariably, women tend to get growth scans booked in if they have a BMI measured above 35. And the growth scans, there tend to be 3 of them, and they will be sort of anxiety inducing and reassuring at the same time. You get to see your baby, and they're nice, but they're worrying. But then often there might be a recommendation of induction on the back of that. We think your baby's growing a bit bigger. They are notoriously sort of inaccurate as well. So there's lots of uncertainty around it. So big babies and inductions, gestational diabetes. There are lots of worries around just the not with obstetricians and midwives so much, but just worries around kind of will I get a bump? When will I get a bump? When will I feel my baby moving? Will it be different for me? Those are we get a lot of discussion around that in my community as well. Developing preeclampsia, that's another one, and early in pregnancy, increased risk of miscarriage. That's in my first trimester mini course. There's a lot of reassurance on that, because again, people just think it's high risk. They're likely to miscarry, and statistically, that is just not the case.
That's really interesting.
And the reassurance just isn't out there, because you just, as you were trying to, I wish I knew the answers, trying to pinpoint why do we uses binary high risk and low risk categories, within our system. There's
Obviously very
nothing.
nuanced though, isn't it? And systemic, I think. That's the problem. And then there'll be there'll
Yeah.
be bias in research as well, and maybe people misunderstanding their responsibility in the managing risk in the process, and
Yeah.
people who are very busy under pressure.
Mm.
I mean, thinking about when I was just listening to you then, I also remember being told that our son was going to be a big baby, and he wasn't. He was 7 pounds 4, very
Yeah.
average.
Well, I think so.
Um,
So they've just finished a big study called the Big Baby Trial.
mm,
They just finished it. They stopped it early actually because they realised this is here now. It's a really difficult one to summarise really succinctly. They stopped it early because they sort of did the calculations about how many numbers they would need to recruit. They realised that they'd really underpowered that. They hadn't got enough women in the study, and
mm,
once there were sort of a few thousand women in, but before the end, they stopped the study. And what they were looking at was whether inducing women early, when they thought when the baby was thought to be big, whether inducing at 38 weeks would reduce the numbers of babies that had a shoulder dystocia. So when the baby's head's born, but the shoulder gets stuck. And one thing that's a very scary thought. And one thing that always gets missed from that story is that following it's rare, and following that happening, 85% of the cases just are resolved by helping the woman to move her legs into a different position. So it's incredibly rare that causes any sort of ongoing damage to a mum or a baby. But anyway, that's what they wanted to. Would be great if we could predict or prevent those happening. But by doing a cesarean section, we don't know how we can prevent that. But they did this trial to see, is 38 weeks a good time to induce somebody that we think has a big baby. And this wasn't, just to be clear, it wasn't plus size women, it's anybody who was predicted to be having a big baby. And what one interesting thing that they found was that 60% of the babies were overestimated on scan on their weight. So it happens a lot. So scans are really, they're much better, and this is good. They're much better at identifying those babies that are small, that have kind of blood flow restriction, and that have problems, and that perhaps are should be born because it's not a good environment for them anymore, to be in utero. But babies, as they grow bigger, you just would think, if you don't know anything about it, you'd think, well, as the baby grows bigger, we just get to see more. It's easier. But actually, that 20-week scan is the ideal time and size to see a baby's anatomy and skeleton and organs. And then as they grow bigger, it gets more and more difficult. And estimating is difficult. And there is a margin. But even when you've got that margin and you've been told the estimated weight, it's still there in your mind, isn't it? And you feel like, oh, maybe this baby isn't big, but I'm worried now. They're worrying me now, telling me to have an induction now.
this is it. It's exactly that. And I think some of the language that's used in medical settings. So after my birth, I did have some complications completely unrelated to weight. But interestingly, when I did my debrief following with a consultant, which was very rushed and hurried and felt like they didn't have time for, and I was quite traumatized by some elements. And I never forget them saying to me, like flicking through my file and like putting the file down and going, okay, so you've got an incompetent cervix. So, if you were to get pregnant again, then you can't give birth vaginally. It was very matter of fact, brusque. And I thought, incompetent cervix. I was like, wow, I'll put that on my CV and my record of achievement. And it was just so like, I don't know, some of the language that's used in medicalised environments is just horrendous. And for people, particularly, who, if you don't identify as sort of plus size, and people with, like you said, all these extra things can kick in from a BMI of 30, which, actually isn't very high. And a lot of people with a BMI of 30 would never consider themselves to be classed as having a higher BMI. And so, the handling of these situations, I think, is often the same as whether you've got a BMI of 30 or whether you've got a really high BMI. But even then, it should be the same in lots of ways in terms of the way that people are treated. But, sometimes things are said to people who've never considered that perhaps they've even got a higher BMI. And with the crass language, I think that sometimes is used and just not well thought through in the delivery, that can have a lasting impact on people. And I don't think that's always considered. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think this it's misogynist, isn't it? In its kind of, in its roots, there's so much of it in maternity care. Incompetence. That's just my charger going in. Sorry.
It's all right.
So, my daughter plays tricks on me in my technology. Um, yeah. So, incompetent cervix is one. Failure to progress when you're in
Yeah.
labour. So, and all that stuff around being kind of an older mum when you're over 35, and also just we have within kind of plus size care, there's obviously, to me, a problem when you've got a clinical term which is obesity, but most practitioners, and I'm not advocating that they should use it, but that we have this clinical term that we'll use, and then we wouldn't say, but we wouldn't say it to people, because it's stigmatizing. So really, we sort, that poses a problem. It sums up that we have a huge kind of issue, that there's a huge problem with language and speaking respectfully to people, respecting their bodies, and their choices and their priorities. The kind of it's a kind of the paternalistic way, the sort of hierarchy in the way that it's I suppose doctors. It's traditionally there will be male doctors, female midwives, and obviously it would be women giving birth, and the idea that they are sort of in charge and they understand and finding ways to control women's bodies because they're not good at doing it themselves. No.
Yeah. Oh no, 100%. And is there any evidence of having higher BMI and that then impacting on you having a healthy baby at the end of your pregnancy?
Do you mean in terms of physiologically, or what the?
Yeah, I suppose in terms of outcomes for you as like the person giving birth and for that baby, is there evidence around, if you've got a higher BMI, does it negatively impact on the outcomes of how healthy you're going to be by the time you've given birth and how healthy a child is going to be based on your size?
Well, it's not based on your size. So you and there was some interesting research done around so the arguments around things like water birth and access to midwife-led units, etc., are around your pregnancy will probably be uncomplicated, but it might be complicated, and there are larger numbers of women who have a higher BMI who have complicated pregnancies, but the vast majority of women of any size don't have complicated pregnancies. And the problems can be sort of compounded because this high risk label means that we as health professionals might start to treat women like they have a complicated pregnancy. And, we know that women having an intervention-free birth with a midwife continuously looking after them will lead to a better outcome than having, for most women, than having an induction at 38 weeks or 39 weeks or 40 weeks. So it's complicated. You might develop preeclampsia and you might develop gestational diabetes and you might develop both and you might have complications, and that might impact upon the outcome for you and your baby. So typically, the reason that we are concerned about preeclampsia for babies is it tends to affect blood flow and their growth. So unfortunately, it's reasonably reasonably common still. It affects around about 1 in 20 pregnancies. It's usually quite mild, fortunately. Doctors are quite good at treating it in most cases, but we don't really know what causes it apart from it's something to do with the way the placenta develops. And it is more common in women that are plus size gestational diabetes is. But I think that the way to respond to that is to screen. So we screen women all the time through pregnancy to make sure that preeclampsia and gestational diabetes aren't developing. And that's what we should do for all women. So there's not necessarily a need to differentiate because of your size. And then you either develop preeclampsia or GD, or you don't. And if you get to the day when you go into labour and your BMI is 35 or 40 or 45, and you just go into labour, then, labour and birth are just part of pregnancy. They're the end bit of pregnancy. So it's a part of the same continuum. And having had a problem-free pregnancy is a very good indicator that you'll have a problem-free labour and birth. So, it's a very good argument to give somebody the care that, if that's what they want, and a lot of women do, to have a midwife that looks after them, and to have for things which will help them to have an intervention-free birth, rather than saying, because across the whole population we've noticed that it might be a tiny bit more likely that your baby's shoulders might get stuck. We think you should, your high, or your high, it becomes higher risk. Your baby looks a bit bigger, you're higher risk for shoulder dystocia. You don't want your baby's shoulders to get stuck. That's a very dangerous situation. That's that. Or, as you had, we won't let you go beyond 40 weeks because it just becomes high risk for stillbirth. So you should have an induction, and obviously the risks do increase a little bit, and for some women, and you might argue particularly for women who've had a long journey with IVF or not, or a long journey to pregnancy. Again, you give people the numbers and they can decide whether they want to have an induction, because they might think, if there's a tiny increase in the risk of stillbirth at 40 weeks, then I want to have an induction. I want to get this baby out at 40 weeks now. I don't want to, that's fine. But it needs to be your choice. You shouldn't just be told that's what we're doing because that's safest. Risks start to increase, and you're high risk, so we'll do this.
Exactly. That's the point, isn't it? And I think that's what's not always happening, that we need to be given the information and then we should be able to make the decisions. But I think we're too often told, and we accept that that's the way that things are, even when we're not comfortable, or even when we don't fully understand why recommendations being made. And, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Like, inclusive care, to me, for all, plus size or not, is that you are given the evidence, given the information, and then you make the choice. And unfortunately, that just doesn't happen everywhere all of the time, does it?
I think it doesn't happen in a lot of places a lot of the time, unfortunately, what I hear. So
yeah, me too.
So that's why what I try to do is, because I want to build the Heavyweight Midwife to be the biggest thing, the biggest influence, that I can be. But through the Heavyweight Midwife, I'm asking people to realize that they're not going along to appointments just waiting to see what happens, that they can go and ask for what they want, because I'm not, I teach students, and I speak publicly, and I do everything that I can on my platform to influence the way that healthcare is provided. But that is a big battle, and it's a battle that you haven't got time for if you're pregnant now. So you need to have the simple tools to ask questions, to know how to advocate for yourself, to get the support that you need, and to ask the right questions, because your healthcare provider is an evidence-based practitioner. That's how they've been trained. They know where to find the evidence, and they can go away and find you those numbers. So if you ask something like, if you get a high risk cited at you that you're high risk, then just ask them how many plus size women in 100 will be affected by this complication that you're talking to me about, and compared to other women. And it's fine for you to come back to me with that. I don't expect you to know it now, but it's fine
Mhm.
because that will just help me to get perspective rather than just the high risk label, which is just quite scary. So there is just really, really simple tools and questions that I give to people so they can come away from the appointment feeling good rather than a little bit steamrolled.
Yeah, no, that's really, really good advice. Thank you. And what about if people are feeling dismissed or shamed as perhaps somebody navigating pregnancy in a larger
Mm.
body? What can they do?
Yeah, so I know I did say to you at the beginning that it's a bit potluck. So that's part of the fear is like, what who's the when you get pregnant, you go along to this first midwife appointment. It's big, the booking appointment. They take your history and they tell you all about the care that you're going to receive. It takes about an hour usually. Um, and it's potluck, isn't it? Your midwife will probably be lovely. In my experience, probably be that really lovely person, but you don't know what's going to happen there. You don't know, you know. And I know of women that have even, and I keep coming back to water birth as an example, but I do get asked about water birth a lot. So I
Mhm.
talk about it a lot. So they a lot of midwives will have on their list of questions. They got lots of tick boxes and questions to ask. Um, and one will be, have you thought about what you want for birth yet? And if you said, oh, I really fancy a midwife-led unit or a home birth or a water birth, um, then they might say, oh, that sounds great, and that's absolutely something, that's, that's a wonderful thing. I've helped at lots of water births, etc., etc. Or she might say, well, I've calculated your BMI and it's 40, so you won't be able to do that at a hospital. And
Mm.
you don't know what's going to happen when you say that. Or you might feel scared to say it because you're not quite sure what the response will be. So what I always say, like with that example or any example, if you go into an obstetrician appointment, because if you will be referred to consultant-led care if your BMI is above 35, which is also your choice, by the way. It might not be presented as such, but it is your choice
Ah.
or not. Um, well, I mean, everything is a choice, but it should be presented to you as a choice.
Mhm.
Um, if they say to you, well, we probably will want to, sometimes consultants will say when you're 16 weeks, they'll say, well, we'll want to induce you when you get to 38 weeks or 39 weeks. Um, and you definitely can't go to the midwife-led unit. That's not going to be safe for you. Um, I always say, if you come up against a conversation like that, it's deflating and it's upsetting. But don't assume that what they're saying to you is the end of that conversation, because what really you're just not talking to the right person yet. And there will be, other people that you can speak to. So you can, if you want to, if you want a second opinion immediately, or you want to complain about the way you've been spoken to, then there will be people at your hospital trust that you can contact about that. But just in terms of getting access to what you want, then there are, don't just take it as the midwife said that I couldn't do that, um, because if your midwife's probably not correct, and you shouldn't take it as the end of that conversation. Um,
Yeah, and that's so helpful because what we're not saying on this episode of this podcast, and what Alice is not saying, and I agree, we're not saying ignore medical advice. What we're saying is ask questions, ask them to
mm,
explain to you the evidence
absolutely,
and reasoning so that you then understand and can make the best informed decision for yourself.
yeah,
That's all that we're saying
absolutely,
here. It's not about ignoring medical advice, but sometimes we're given this broad brush
yeah,
advice actually wrapped up in not as advice, in that this is
mm,
what you're doing.
yeah, and
It goes against everything that you want to do. And it's about feeling that you can speak up. I think the example you gave earlier, Alice, of like a question that people could ask will really, really help people. Because I think you're right. A lot of people don't feel well informed enough or confident enough to
yeah,
say things back to medical professionals, and especially if you've never had a baby before as well, or if you've got some belief in yourself that the reason that there might be problems is because you're um living in a bigger body, so all of that can compound as well. And I think it's just really useful for people to understand that there are choices and that it's okay to ask questions. It's not being difficult, you're not being
no,
challenging, you're just
just
seeking
about
to obtain more information, aren't you?
it's just about understanding what
Yeah.
if you don't understand yet, then it's not even necessarily I'm pushing back here. It's just like I want to
No.
know more about this. Can you explain that again? Um, I actually say to people sometimes, a trick, a sort of tip to get your confidence up in asking questions is ask, when you go to your consultant appointment, just ask them to go over something again that actually you think you have understood, but just because you can, and it makes you feel a bit more confident. Can you just repeat that for me? Because I just want to make sure that I understood that.
Yes.
But it just helps you to feel a bit empowered. It's just that first kind of step, to get them to explain it again. And I mean, I absolutely not. I am absolutely wouldn't ever say to somebody to go against medical advice or to ignore medical advice. I think a couple of things. So what I touched on earlier, there's a very big difference between having a sort of broad risk factor, but you actually have no complications, and having an actual pre-existing medical condition or a complication of pregnancy. When you have a complicated pregnancy, that's a very different thing, and absolutely you need those doctors on your side, and giving you all their attention. But if you have a risk factor that's not causing you any complications, that's just about kind of guesswork around what populations of women's health and bodies might do in pregnancy. And the flip side of kind of not ignoring medical advice is that I always encourage people to kind of really check in with their feelings as well. And one of the reasons for that is that sometimes somebody, a health professional, can be saying things to you that you don't like, or they can be speaking to you in a way that you don't like, and you don't like them, and you're not having a good interaction. But what they're saying to you might be clinically important. So it's checking in with your feelings and kind of how are you feeling? What's the response that you're having, and what's the reason for that? But what are they actually saying? So separating those two things and not kind of ignoring what somebody is saying because they're not being very nice to you is a really important thing. So it's complicated, but that's a good way to differentiate. Is there a complication happening here, or are they just talking to me about sort of guesswork around the fact that I've got a raised BMI? What are they actually basing it? And the last thing to say, I guess, is that yes, when you go to the evidence, when you look at the evidence that underpins our guidelines, a lot of the time it's not very strong either. So depending on how much of a nerd you are, or whether you just want to talk to me, I think the guidelines for plus size care have got about 67 recommendations, and 3 of them are based on kind of absolutely grade A, solid, like lots of international randomized control trials, gold standard research. Not that there's no evidence for the rest of it, but it's always incredibly complicated. So become like channel that when your child goes through that stage, you're going, why? But why? Why is that? And tell me a bit more about the evidence, and where can I find out more about it and make my own decision?
I love that. I think that's a really, really important sort of final point for everyone listening to this to be able to take away with them. Thank you so much, Alice. I literally could talk to you about this all day. And I think that the things that you've said in this podcast will really resonate with a lot of people listening. And I think you'll have made a whole lot of people feel a lot better and know how they can advocate for themselves. And I just think it's been a really interesting episode. So thank you so much for coming on. But will you tell people, please, how they can connect with you and find out more about your work? And then I will pop all Alice's links in the show notes. You can go and follow her over on TikTok and Instagram. But I'll hand over to you, Alice, to tell people that, and then go and connect with Alice.
Yeah, lovely. So yeah, you can find me on TikTok and Instagram at the Heavyweight Midwife, and over at theheavyweightmidwife.com if you want to arrange to speak to me in a one-to-one or to access any of my courses. If you are on an IVF journey, on a fertility journey, as I mentioned before, I know that women, all that anxiety that goes into wanting that pregnancy, as soon as you get pregnant, it's such an amazing feeling, but it is very quickly, in my experience, taken over by anxieties around the pregnancy. And I have a mini course that you can grab as soon as you're pregnant, which is very inexpensive, to reassure you and get you ready for your appointments and your care and navigating the new journey.
Yeah, and from personal experience and from helping hundreds of people over the last almost 6 years to do this, you don't think past the point of getting pregnant and then think the anxiety goes away. And I think you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, for many, not all, but many people, that elation of that positive pregnancy test is short-lived. And it's very much onto the worrying about the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So I think knowing that there are people like you out there and with courses and your community and things, just know that people have got a place to go to get that support for their next stage in that continuum. Because like I say, people often don't think past the point of getting pregnant, because at that point you can't ever believe you're ever going to become pregnant and then have a live birth. So I think it's super important. Thank you so much, Alice, for coming on. It's been brilliant. Go and check out the show notes and reach out to Alice, and I will see you next week for another episode of the IVF Abroad podcast. Bye.
Bye.
If you are facing more obstacles than options and want to learn more about how to overcome your fertility testing and treatment challenges in your home country so that you too can fast track to growing your family and on your terms, then check out my free training at yourivfabroad.co.uk/free masterclass. Don't forget to rate and subscribe so you don't miss an episode and so that I can reach and help more people. Thanks for listening.